Hi, everybody. Today, we're looking at No Witchcraft for Sale, a short story by Doris Lessing. We'll start with a brief summary of the story. Then, we'll look at the main characters and the major conflicts that drive the story forward. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the main characters and the traits they possess. You should also be able to describe the major conflicts in the story and explain how each character responds to them. Finally, you should be able to find the theme, or overall lesson, message, or moral of the story by analyzing the characters, conflicts, and other literary elements that make up the story. Remember, a story can have more than one theme. Let's go over a quick summary of the story. The story takes place in what is now Zimbabwe. We find out that the Farquhars, an affluent white couple, have been trying to have a baby. The baby, Teddy, finally arrives and is befriended by Gideon, the Farquhar's servant and cook, who has a child about the same age as Teddy. Gideon calls Teddy Little Yellowhead for his blonde hair, and the two are nearly inseparable while Teddy is young. When Teddy is about 6, he scares away a young black boy and is reprimanded by Gideon. Teddy answers, "He's only a black boy," and laughs. Gideon is shocked at Teddy's behavior, and he begins to distance himself from Teddy, which hurts Teddy's feelings. As Teddy gets older, he takes a more formal, authoritative stance toward Gideon, and their relationship transitions from a friendship to a servant-master relationship. One day, a snake spits in Teddy's eyes. Mrs. Farquhar begs Gideon to do something to prevent Teddy from going blind. Gideon rushes outside into the bush and quickly returns with a plant, which he uses to cure Teddy and restore his eyesight. The story about Gideon's miracle cure begins to circulate, and the Farquhars speak to a scientist. They're put off by the idea of the cure being used to make money, but they like the idea of helping others. They introduce the scientist to Gideon and ask him to share the cure. Gideon at first refuses, but after a standoff between him and the Farquhars, he leads the Farquhars and the scientist into the bush. He leads them all over, covering many miles, and even going through a storm. Eventually, he stops to pick up a bunch of blue flowers and hands them to the scientist. The scientist, who never believed a cure existed, throws the flowers into the back of his car and thanks Gideon. Things stay tense between Gideon and the Farquhars for some time, but they're able to eventually diffuse the tension and laugh about the incident. The story ends with Teddy asking Gideon if he remembers the time Gideon tricked them by leading them all over looking for the plant. Teddy is laughing as he remembers, but Gideon looks sadly at Teddy, noting that soon he will be all grown up with a farm of his own. Now let's look more carefully at our main characters, the Farquhars, Gideon, Teddy, and the scientist. The Farquhars are a well-off white couple. Their race and affluence give them status, and they employ a number of native African servants. We don't know much about Mr. Farquhar, but we can make some inferences about Mrs. Farquhar based on her behavior throughout the story. Mrs. Farquhar begins as a sympathetic character. We know she struggled to have a child, so as readers, we celebrate along with the other characters when Teddy arrives. We also see the way Mrs. Farquhar appreciates the visits and gifts from the servants when Teddy is born. She also raises Gideon's wages to show her appreciation of the way he treats Teddy. These behaviors lead us to view her as someone who's compassionate and warm. However, a deeper look into her motivations shows us that there may be another side of Mrs. Farquhar. She raises Gideon's wages, but not the wages of the other servants. Unlike Gideon, whose family lives with him at the Farquhar's compound, the other servants sometimes have to travel hundreds of miles away to see their family. Mrs. Farquhar doesn't like it when her servants leave. Even though so far we've come to know her as a family-oriented person, her views toward the servants show us that she can be insensitive and unfair. We see similar behavior when Gideon points out to her that while his son is the same age as Teddy, Gideon's son will grow up to be a servant, while Teddy will grow up to be a master. Mrs. Farquhar's unquestioning acceptance of this fact shows us that from her privileged position, she doesn't seem bothered by the inequalities between her own family and the families of her servants. Next, let's look at Gideon. Gideon is kind and caring in his relationship with Teddy, going beyond the requirements of his job as a cook to spend time with Teddy. He also seems realistic about his status, noting that like him, his son will grow up to be a servant. However, we also know that Gideon is the son of a famous native doctor and is highly respected in his local community, even if the Farquhars know him only as a cook and caregiver to Teddy. Lessing's depiction of Teddy is mixed in the same way that her depiction of Mrs. Farquhar is. Teddy isn't a bad person. He seems to genuinely care for Gideon, and he becomes truly upset when their relationship starts to change. However, his privileged position prevents him from recognizing the unjust nature of the society he's grown up in. As he gets older, his attitudes and behavior show that he's internalized societal expectations of how someone with his status should act. Now let's look at the scientist, our final main character. He's interested in how the root could help humanity and make money. However, we know he's skeptical about native medicine from the time he arrives. He doesn't think Gideon really has a cure. He's especially condescending toward Gideon, and he doesn't believe it's possible that a native remedy could cure something modern science and technology can't. Now let's review the major conflicts in the story, which all revolve around Gideon. The story primarily focuses on how imperialist nations, such as Great Britain, consider their views and technologies to be superior to the traditional ways and beliefs of the colonized people. In this story, that conflict plays out in the interactions Gideon has with the scientist and the Farquhars after he uses the native root to cure Teddy. In his external conflict with the Farquhars, Gideon feels betrayed because he shared secret knowledge with them, and they called in the scientist. This conflict puts him in a difficult position. As their servant, he's expected to obey the Farquhars, but he also doesn't want to betray the sacred knowledge to the scientist. And in his external conflict with the scientist, Gideon hides his wealth of knowledge, perpetuating a cycle of arrogance as Westerners come in with the belief that native medicine is inferior to modern science and technology. The scientist typifies this arrogant attitude in his condescending behavior toward Gideon, and Gideon can't correct the scientist's misplaced belief without giving away his community's sacred knowledge, which the scientist is likely to exploit for money. The most important conflict in the story, though, is Gideon's internal conflict with himself. On the one hand, sharing the cure could benefit others and also show the world the wealth of knowledge that can be found in native medicine. However, this also comes with the possibility of exploitation, and Gideon ultimately decides to keep the cure to himself, trying to find a way to diffuse tension with the Farquhars without explicitly defying them. In this unjust society, keeping his sacred knowledge to himself is the only true form of resistance available to Gideon. Though the story ends with somewhat of a reconciliation between Gideon and the Farquhars, we see Gideon's silent acknowledgement that the status quo in this unjust society has been maintained. As readers, we can only wonder whether Gideon's small act of resistance has made any difference at all. Now let's analyze the main themes of the story. Doris Lessing spent much of her childhood and early adulthood in what is now Zimbabwe. During that time, she grew more sensitive to issues of racism and became involved in radical politics. What does Lessing seem to be saying about the impacts of imperialism? How do imperialist systems affect individuals, both those who have power and those who have none? Consider the behavior of someone like Gideon, who has only limited power, versus that of the Farquhars and the scientist. How does each character wield power? How is each character impacted by the way they interact with and treat the other characters? Who wins and who loses? How is the overall society maintained or reshaped based on the actions of our main characters? Based on all of this, what message do you think the author is trying to share with readers? What is the lesson that you take away from this story? Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the story.